Hello and welcome to the Stanley Dyrector Show. We are privileged to broadcast show number 1 of our 3-part series on the Hollywood Blacklist from the Francis Howard Goldwyn Library in Hollywood. How ironic. Now, let me tell you a brief rundown. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was later known as the McCarthy period. HUAC frightened Hollywood. Now, show number... Hello and welcome to the Stanley Dyrector Show. We are privileged to broadcast show number 1 of our 3-part series on the Hollywood Blacklist from the Francis Howard Goldwyn Library in Hollywood. How ironic. Now, let me tell you a brief rundown. The House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, was later known as the McCarthy period. HUAC frightened Hollywood studio bosses and caused the blacklist. Its first victims of hate and intimidation were the Hollywood 10, who were subpoenaed to Washington, D.C. to testify in 1947 about their membership in the Communist Party. They pleaded the First Amendment. Now, a few years later, our distinguished guests were named and blacklisted as communists. Jean Rouverol started her career as an actress at MGM. She's written screenplays and fiction and nonfiction. Jean was married to the blacklisted screenwriter Hugo Butler. Her book is called Refugees from Hollywood. Bernard Gordon was a story editor at Paramount. He's a screenwriter, producer, who wrote such films as 55 Days at Peking, the original The Thin Red Line, and his book is Hollywood Exile. Oliver Crawford was an actor on Broadway who became a playwright, screen and television writer. He wrote Quincy, Starsky and Hutch. Oliver's play is called Ollie, Folly, and the Blacklist. Robert Lees was a dancer and actor at MGM. As a screenwriter with his collaborator Fred Rinaldo, they wrote Robert Benchland shorts and Abbott and Costello movies. Now, on show number 1, our guests will discuss their lives before the blacklist. On show number 2, how they got blacklisted and its effect. Show number 3 will be about their life after the blacklist. So, Jean, can you take us back to another time and tell us how and why you got involved with the Communist Party?
Gladly. And I hope that you'll excuse me for using cue cards. I'm turning 85 next month, and doggone it, my memory isn't worth a darn. So I need help. Anyway, the day that Waldo Salt, who was then a junior writer at Metro, introduced me to his office mate, Hugo Butler, it was, I think, sometime in November of 1936. I just gotten back to Hollywood from my second Broadway flop. One lasted 3 weeks, one lasted 2. So much for theater. And at barely 17, I had been quote, discovered in a play in the Pasadena Playhouse and signed to a Hollywood contract, which I didn't really want. I took theater seriously, but I thought movies were just a loused-up version of plays. While I was at Paramount and immediately after, I'd played W.C. Field's daughter in It's a Gift, if you ever watch old movies, a schizophrenic in Walter Wanger's Private Worlds, leads in a few westerns and a Republic mystery, and cameos or character parts in bigger pictures. That day, it took me about 30 seconds to fall wildly in love with Hugo, and within 5 months we were married and moved into a little apartment on North Beechwood, about 5 blocks from here. Hugo, who unlike me really understood and loved movies, was quickly writing or co-writing his way out of the junior writer department with pictures like Christmas Carol, Huckleberry Finn, Lassie Come Home, and the 2 Edison pictures, while I was heading out at dawn for sometimes leads, sometimes cameos in Stage Door, The Road Back, a couple of Crime Doesn't Pay shorts co-written by my friend Bobby Leafs here. And when successive pregnancies began to make movie work impossible, I started a 3rd-year run on a much-loved radio series called One Man's Family. Does anybody ever remember? Anybody here old enough to remember that one? Wow, okay. Thank you. It was during this period that I also got a junior writer contract at Metro and began that career too. Hugo had already become active in the early struggles of the Screenwriters Guild, and we had made friends significantly with a couple of new recruits to Hollywood named Ring Lardner Jr. and Dalton Trumbo. By now, the political atmosphere of Hollywood was changing. My fellow panelists will tell you all about that. We were all equally affected by the rise of fascism abroad and the grim face of the Great Depression at home. Hugo, in the meantime, had been hired to adapt two of his favorite books, the Depression love story All Brides Are Beautiful, which became the movie From This Day Forward, and later Hold Autumn in Your Hand, a haunting book about a family of sharecroppers, directed by Jean Renoir and released as The Southerner. Altogether, when Walter Salt invited us to join the Communist Party, we didn't need any convincing at all. When Hugo was drafted late in World War II, we went off to training camp, convinced that he was joining a people's army to fight a people's war. Think how long that lasted. Just about the time it took for him to get through basic training. Boy, was he anxious to come home. When the birth of our third child made him eligible for release, he was only too happy. In his absence, however, I'd begun selling novellas to McCall. The first one, now remember, he's getting $35 a month as a buck private. I sold my first story for $5,000. And oh boy, did it sound good. Anyway, having been placed on leave from the party during his army service, as I was, Hugo decided once home to rejoin. But about my rejoining, he said, listen, with 3 kids, the radio job, the PTA, and your writing, Christ, I'd never see you. So I didn't rejoin, but I remained a staunch Marxist. Once again, we plunged into our busy lives. We mortgaged our souls to buy a big old turn-of-the-century craftsman house up on Briar Cliff, just off of Canyon Drive. You know that area? And then in 47, with the Cold War in full cry, Trumbo, Lardner, and 8 other of the Hollywood 10 were called before HUAC. And I'll tell you later how that affected us.
Bernard Gordon, can you tell us your story, please?
Well, I was born in New Britain, Connecticut, but I really grew up in the Bronx, so I have to confess, and you could probably hear the accent is still there. I'm a Bronx boy, and I grew up through the Depression, and I knew lines of people waiting outside the cold for a cup of coffee or a little soup. I knew the fact that everything was wrong in this country. It looked like capitalism wasn't working at all, that people's furniture was being thrown out on the street. There were no jobs. There was something like 40% unemployment. My father had a little hardware store, and he lost everything because of the crash. I went to City College, and I decided I want to be a movie maker. And so with a $16 share the ride to California from Los Angeles, I finally got here with $10 in my pocket, and here I am. I got a job as a reader at Paramount, and soon it was understood that I had a radical bent, and I was recruited into the party, which was very easy for me to do because I had lived through the Depression. I had seen the things that were wrong in this country. I knew about racism. I knew about unemployment. I knew about depression. I knew that it seemed to an awful lot of us in those days that capitalism really was a failed system, and that the future belonged to socialism of one kind or another. So I joined. In 1947, when the first hearings were held in Washington, that's when the Hollywood 10 appeared, I was named by someone I didn't know as a communist sympathizer. Some attorney who knew me here because of my trade union activity got up and said, "You can't do this. Mr. Gordon is not here. He can't defend himself." And, of course, he was gavelled down. I found out about it in the trade papers the next day. This time I was assistant story editor, and nothing was said at the studio. This was Paramount. Until a couple of months later, and in the end of December, when my wife and I were expecting our first child, I got a Christmas present of having been fired after 7 years. I consider myself prematurely blacklisted. I'm the first person I know who was actually fired for political reasons in this town.
On our next show, we're going to cover the full blacklist. Oliver Crawford, Can you please tell us what it was like before you were blacklisted?
Well, I was born and raised in Chicago during a tough period when there was an attempted Capone takeover of the dairy industry. My father was a milkman, and he was one of the organizers of the American Federation of Labor in that city. As a 14-year-old boy, I would help him out. We had these big wagons with these Clydesdale horses you see pulling beer. And he carried a gun. And I was terrified. Now, in those days, you've got to understand there were no unions, no minimum wage, no pensions, no Social Security, no Medicare, none of the things we knew about. Strictly a laissez-faire system. I can recall working in a department store from 9 in the morning until 9 at night for $1.75. Or I go to an unemployment line where they would hire over a weekend, same department store, there'd be a line, I'd take my place, and I'd sell my place for a quarter to some married man who had a family. At any rate, it was very easy to be radicalized, and certainly I was receptive to the social ferment. I was only a kid, and actually, one of the attractions, and of course in those days, for what the Communist Party represented, it is always a legal entity, even at its most vilified period, was never outlawed. At any rate, I was proselytized. However, I did not join until after I came to Hollywood after World War II. But during those formative years in Chicago, I did hang around with people who lived in a world of paper, books, and ideas. And also, there was a great rumor that the Communist Party espoused free love. Well, I had juices, and that was certainly most attractive. Let me tell you, that's a base canard. Maybe these other guys were luckier, not me. At any rate, that was my Chicago phase. I got married in 41 and was drafted in 1943. 3.5 years in the Army, overseas, came back, and we had no children. And of course, the two centers of entertainment were largely West Coast Hollywood and East Coast New York. So I was in the Pacific Theater. My wife met me. And I was then mostly a young actor. I'd done some special service work in the Army Jeep teams. We went into places that the USOs wouldn't go to. They were inaccessible. We took Jeep teams. Mickey Rooney was on one of them. Anyway, came back. I got a fairly honorable discharge. And my wife was very practical. She was a legal secretary, volunteer services to a then premier acting organization called the Actors Lab. And she arranged for me to have an audition. It was very difficult because they were an offshoot, some of you may recall, it goes way back, of the old Groove Theater in New York. And I did a scene from Watch on the Rhine, and my three judges were Anthony Quinn, Danny Mann, who was a fine director, and the head of the lab, and I passed it, and I became an actor. And scrambling for parts, but I wasn't tall, and I wasn't good looking, and so on. So it was pretty rough. And in the meantime, I always liked to write. I was always doodling. And in the meantime, something called television was coming along. And screenwriters disdained it. It was below them. And they felt it was, it was a box.
Very good, Albert. Now, I'm going to get to that part a little later, but now I'm going to get to Mr. Robert Lees. Robert, can you tell us, please, well, what you did before you were blacklisted?
Well, after all, I'm kind of a strange position because I was born in San Francisco, kind of a middle-class Jewish family. I didn't have any of the problems that some of you guys had. And I was a star kind of actor at Lowell High School, and I was deciding I was going to be an actor. I came down to Los Angeles at the time of the Depression in 1930 to go to UCLA because my father's business at this point fell apart. It was the start of the Depression, but he fell apart a little earlier. So when I came to Los Angeles, and I was at UCLA, my father said, "What are you doing there? We can't afford to do this." But I had a connection through my father with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. So I went there to become an actor, a chorus boy. I danced a Dancing Lady. I was a bellboy in Grand Hotel. I was in Rasputin and the Empress, and I was with Greta Garbo in a thing called As You Desire Me with Melvin Douglas. I was the boatman. They curled up my hair. I had long black hair, which they curled up. And then I tried to dance in Dancing Lady, and I didn't know how to do a time step, couldn't learn it. Stuffed my shoe with toilet paper so I would look taller. The shoe came off while I was dancing. The toilet paper came out like serpentine. They stopped everything and said, "What the hell's going on?" And I was very embarrassed, but the dance director said, "I've never seen anything quite like this." He says, "You're too short," I was taller than he was, "to be in the chorus. You can't dance, but you got a lot of guts. I'll tell you what, I'll make you an assistant." So that was the start of my career, and when I found out that I could have a screen test, I wrote it. Unfortunately, I wrote it. No, fortunately, I wrote it, but unfortunately, I was a lousy actor. So they turned around and said, "The acting is lousy, the writing is good, you should be a junior writer." So I became a junior writer at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer at the same time that the Screenwriters Guild was starting to be organized and all the things that Bernie Gordon was talking about. Hollywood was really my kindergarten for being progressive. My collaborator came from Dartmouth. He had learned a lot in Dartmouth, where he met Betty Schulberg and Maurice Rapp, who had gone to the Soviet Union and come back and were going saying it's a wonderful place. And all the kids and all the guys in my generation were all pretty much the same generation, and Hugo, were all taken into this wonderful spirit of we can do something about it, and Hollywood was rampant. We had the Anti-Nazi League. We had the Anti-Fascist League against fascism. We were doing ambulances for Spain. Everything at this particular moment saying if you're a writer and you're a progressive and you're organizing the Screenwriters Guild, I'm an absolute charter member, you better do it with an organization that knows what it's doing. Because all these things were related. And the Communist Party at that time knew they were related and were functioning in all those areas. And I functioned with them. And I learned a great deal. So from my San Francisco Republican background, I became pretty much politicalized. So much so that, of course, when the time came, which I won't get into, but what I did in the meantime... In the meantime, Fred Ronaldo and I went to the shorts department as a group, and I have a picture that maybe we'll show what we call the Brain Trust. Hugo Butler, Alonso Giuseppe, Fred Ronaldo, myself, and a girl called Nikki Justin, who was very great in a party when she was drunk and was very witty, but couldn't write a line of that funny stuff on paper. But they made us all put together, and we were writing together, and when that fell apart, Fred and I became a team and became in the shorts department of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, where we did Bob Benchley's and Pete Smith's and Crime Doesn't Pay, in which Eugene was in it. And we did a lot of stuff like that, and then finally we came up from that area into doing a lot of good comedies. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and 7 others, and Olsen and Johnson and Martin and Lewis. And we had a wonderful career doing all these things as the war came along, and then came the period of the Cold War and came the period of the Blacklist, the Hollywood 10, and that's when the shit hit the fan, so to speak.
Yeah, but I mean, before that happened, didn't you write a movie for Desi Arnaz that kind of did well?
Called Night in Havana, which Desi Arnaz, with his drums and so forth, was in it because there was a contest in Cuba for the best band. Mm-hmm. And our producer at that time said, "There's this crazy character. We don't know what to do with him. And why don't you see what you can help and do it?" And we came back and said, "This guy's pretty damn smart," which he was. And I think Fred and I would have had a chance to do I Love Lucy, but we never had an opportunity. Desi, remember us? Comedy team, How About Lucy? We were dead. Also, do a Bentley short for television. I destroyed my house. I had, incidentally, had a wonderful background and career because I had 3 in help. They were Japanese. My wife was working with the party at the moment. They were trying to get the Japanese who were coming out of the concentration camps jobs. And she went to all our friends and said, "Do something," because these people didn't know where to go. So we happened to be lucky enough to have a mother and 3 daughters who stayed with us. She put them through school, through college. I don't know where she got the money. I paid her the money, but I was broken. But she was a wonderful mother, and she knew how to save money. Mm-hmm. So we had 3 in help, a Buick convertible, lots of credit, money in the bank, and I was supposed to overthrow the government by force and violence. I think this is pretty ridiculous.
That is kind of pretty ridiculous. You know, I just want to make a note that we have a gentleman who is also blacklisted in the audience. And as a matter of fact, he's in a book called Tender Comrades, a very dear gentleman by the name of Julian Zimmett. And I wonder if we have that opportunity. We'll kind of take a little photo of Julian when we have that opportunity. Now, I would like to ask our audience out there if anybody has a question for our group on what they've heard so far. Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is to anybody who wishes to answer it. Going through the prospectus, listening to what you said, I'm wondering, where is, as part of your panel discussion, in terms of equality, the other side to the picture? We're talking about anti-fascism,
Okay.
anti-Nazism.
Okay.
What about anti-communism?
Yeah.
One of the greatest evils besides Nazism.
Okay. This gentleman asked and poses a very good question. Where is the opposition to this panel on anti-Nazism, anti-fascism, and Oliver, you wanted to answer that?
Don't confuse the later climate with what existed then, the social ferment. It was not Cold War. That was invented after the war by Winston Churchill, like depicted the Iron Curtain, and much later Ronald Reagan with the evil empire. Now you've got to understand, communism was in the forefront of virtually every social advantage that we have today. And I'm talking minimum wage. But I'm talking the Wagner Act.
What planet are you on?
Hey,
Communism killed more
right,
people
sure.
than the Nazis ever
This
had.
sir, hold on.
You asked the question.
What, Oliver,
Wonderful people these
wait a minute.
That's
Okay.
right.
They were bad.
This gentleman asks a good question. Or we have discovered that Stalin was a son of a gun,
we had
and
nothing
all
to
of
do
them
with
were bad.
Stalin. It was a philosophy.
I'd like Robert Lees to address this gentleman over here.
I think we have a man here who's really taking the other side vociferously without looking at what the situation is really. The Roosevelt New Deal was considered communist because he did all these things that were supposed to be a traitor to his class. We were all people who remembered Roosevelt as saving the United States and capitalism. We were really with that same attitude of that time. As Ollie said, this was a very legal situation. There was a socialist party, there was a communist party, it was there for a long time. There was nothing illegal about it. We are not Russians. We are not spies. We are American citizens and considered what we were doing very loyal Americans. what came after to turn us into being villains has now been changed a little bit. They're a little behind the times because we did not inform, which we'll get into. We did not do these things. We felt that this country needed what was Roosevelt's program, and we were fostering it. There was nothing illegal, there was nothing dangerous. If we were to do bombing like that was done here, we would have been electrocuted. If we had done anything at all that was illegal, we would have been taken by the police or by whoever it would be. We didn't. We opened our mouths. That's all we did, and that was illegal during the McCarthy period because you could speak.
Yeah. Bernard Gordon. Go ahead, Bernard.
I'd remind the gentleman that, of course, he's entitled to his opinions. I hope I'm entitled to mine. But when I joined the Communist Party in 1942, there was a war on. The Nazis had already destroyed most of Europe and captured it. Roosevelt and America were sending planes and tanks and food and everything possible to the Russians to try to stop the Nazis. And in fact, it was the Russians under Stalin or whoever you like who did stop the Nazis. Now, if you prefer...
They supported the Nazis up to 1941.
Sir,
When the Nazis...
Well, I think you ought to get him. I think you ought to get him up here to be one of the speakers.
let him answer the question.
Possibly saying this with Hitler.
We have...
No, we would not be allowed to disrupt this meeting, sir.
We're not trying to. We're just...
You are. We have... Hold on, sir. 1 minute. Bernard, can you... Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. I would like Bernard and Jean and Oliver to address this gentleman. Bernard, continue,
I simply
please.
wanted to point out, at the time most of us were joining the party, in the party, we were together with the majority of Americans in supporting the Russians in the war against Hitler. And in fact, it was the Russians who did defeat Hitler more than anyone else, if you remember. Now, our position in the party was then that capitalism, as I told you before, was in terrible shape. We were people who were for unemployment insurance, for helping people get jobs, for against racism. These are the things we were for. We were not for Stalin as such. Although, at that time, a great American writer went to the Soviet Union and said, I have seen the future, it worked. Well, it was wrong. It didn't work. We were wrong about some of these things.
We are wrapping it up, folks. We're going to continue our conversation on our next meeting on the Blacklist. Right now, I want you guys, if you'll bear with us, to tune in for our next show about the Hollywood Blacklist when these folks were blacklisted, okay? So let me say good night, Godspeed, God love you, and let me keep talking to my wonderful guests because I am very surprised that we had a little outrage and a little frustration. Perhaps that's good. That's why this is America, because we can dissent. And that's a great feeling in this country. Let me tell you that. And you guys, Gene, I want to thank you. Bernard, I want to thank you. Oliver, I want to thank you. Robert Lees, you made me laugh a lot with Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. And we're going to talk a little more right after we come back, okay? So thank you very much. Well, I want to say something. You were a mother with 6 kids, and this is just mind-boggling that you were able to be a party member and you were able to 4. Oh, only 4. Well, and Bernie and his wife and kids and Holly, kid, and